Good morning, everyone. Welcome. We're going to give everyone a few minutes, about a minute to log in. So we're so grateful you're here for our very first kind of our Year of Health webinar. So I'll start by saying, and I'll probably repeat myself, but if you have any questions during this informative session, we have an email account set up that you can send us your questions so that we can ask Kevin at the end. The email is wellness@pbk.com. So again, if you have any questions or thoughts during this session, we'd love to hear from you. This is our first. So again, it's wellness@pbk.com, and we look forward to hearing from you. And with that, we can kind of get started. I'd like to introduce Kevin Turner. Kevin is going to talk to us a lot today about his work with his colleague and the research he has done. Kevin is an architect, so he has some skin in this game, but he's also a behavioral health expert and has done a lot of work and research in this field. And so we found that there was a lot of lessons that we can learn from his great research. And so we're so excited to have him, as this is May and is Mental Health Month. And so we want to hear from him and some of his great work. So Kevin, please take it away. Thanks so much for coming.
Oh, thanks, Melissa. I am glad to be here. I'm going to hit the share screen mode, which is going to make you all disappear for me. And then we'll start off hoping everything works great. Melissa, can you see that? Everything looks good?
Looks great.
Great. Okay. So welcome, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about designing for inclusivity, trauma-informed design, etc., from the point of view of a behavioral health consulting firm. As soon as I get it to change slides. So quickly, a little bit about us. My partner Sherry was not able to join us today. We ended up double booked. So I'm going to go solo today, but many of my colleagues are on from our small team. So Human Experience is a behavioral health consulting firm, and our sort of kind of the way we talk about this is we're not an architecture firm that does behavioral health. We're a behavioral health firm that does architecture. So I'm an architect. I've been doing this for 30 years, designed every kind of behavioral health environment that could possibly be imagined. My partner Sherry is a clinician by training and has spent much of her career being in the administrative side, leading CEO and operations for psychiatric treatment environments. So we provide a broad conglomeration of design and operational consulting. Sometimes we are the architect, but usually we are advising architects and owners on the design. So because we're in the expert business, we spend a lot of time thinking deeply about some of the things that really make a building work really well. And as Melissa said, we felt like some of these things might be helpful to you all. So we agreed that we'd come and share. So what we're going to talk about today, and this goes to our tagline right there on the slide, is we don't design buildings, we design human experiences. Buildings are just where they take place. So a couple of things before I dig into the material. One is you all, as I understand it, are primarily in the business of designing educational environments. So I don't know very much about that. That's not what we do. So we're going to tell you things that we know that we think apply. And if they don't, that's okay. Take it with a grain of salt, enjoy the pretty pictures. If they do, we hope you learn something, and or you can find a way to translate what I'm going to talk about today into something useful for you. The second big caveat I want to throw out to you is we look a lot at the whole breadth of evidence-based design. We try to make sure the things we're talking about are grounded in research. But the research is vague and sometimes contradictory. So we use a pretty healthy dose of direct experience to inform our design approaches. And that means that you may have a different opinion on one of these topics based on how you've read the research, and that too is okay. In fact, I'd love to hear about it because the best part of teaching is the learning. So my and Sherry's email addresses are on the screen if you want to challenge, amend, contribute in any way to the thoughts and ideas that you hear from me today, we would love to hear from you and learn ourselves, because we're always trying to get better. So with that said, let's dig in. So the press release that went out said we were going to talk about trauma-informed design, and we are. But as I was putting this presentation together, it seemed pretty clear to me that that was the wrong title. So I think there's more to it than just trauma-informed design. So another way to look at it is designing for neurodiversity. And I thought that might be better. We use that term a lot, but that also does not really capture what we're going to talk about today. In our firm, before those two terms became really popular, we always used to just say designing for psychological safety. And even that makes tons of sense in designing behavioral health care, but I'm not sure it's the right phrase for education. So maybe what we're going to talk about today is just good design. So let's just take it in that. This is our thoughts on what makes good design for everyone. So trauma-informed care, and this is one of the joys of having a clinician for a partner. The first time Sherry heard the phrase trauma-informed design, she said, "So do architects just take clinical phrases and change them to design phrases?" And I said, "Yeah, we do that a lot." But the thing is, trauma-informed care is very specifically about dealing with people who have been traumatized, whereas trauma-informed design is really much broader than that. So I will tell you, we in our little group, we love the concepts and ideas in trauma-informed design. We use them extensively. We talk about them extensively. Personal opinion, it's not the best name for it because it's really so much more than just about trauma. Many people are neurodiverse or have other unique ways of experiencing their physical environment that have nothing to do with trauma. And while trauma-informed design really covers all of it, the name can sometimes feel limiting. And we run into challenges with our clients when we use that phrase. So we tend to use the phrase trauma-informed design when talking to architects, but we don't always use it when we're talking to clinicians who see it more limited. But for today's conversation, we're basically talking about the idea that design solutions should recognize the uniqueness of everybody in it, and that designers should design with empathy. And in that, 100% dead on. So another phrase that comes up a lot is neurodiversity. So I have a couple of quotes up here that I will not read to you, but basically neurodiversity is the idea that everybody thinks differently. Everyone's brain works different. Some people's brain works so differently than other people that we give them labels. But really everyone's brain works differently, and neurodiversity is the concept that that's okay. There's no right or wrong way for your brain to work. And we need to design for the whole bell curve, not just the middle, is the idea of designing for neurodiversity. I suspect you all fully understand all this, but to make it a little bit more personal, this is Natalie. Natalie is 15 and my daughter. And coincidentally, just a week ago, she was asking me questions about the word neurodivergent, and we had a very nice conversation about that. And she felt very strongly that it was a really nice word to use when talking broadly about the population, but not a very nice word to use when talking to about a specific person. And she didn't really want to be identified as neurodivergent. So what I can tell you about Natalie is that she is super smart. She loves to read, and she's an amazing writer. She's a very good piano player. She's an actor. She loves Greek mythology, and she really, really loves cats. And those are the kinds of things she would want you to know about her. But if you're designing an educational environment for her, you also need to know that she has ADHD. She's on the spectrum with what I guess used to be called Asperger's, but maybe it's not called that anymore. I get really confused about that. And she has something called misophonia, which is why she's wearing headphones in this picture, because frankly, she is always wearing headphones. So I suspect a fair number of you have started to hear about misophonia, but if you don't know, misophonia is a condition in which your body or your brain overreacts to negative auditory stimuli, which means noises that we all agree are annoying. For her, they're not just annoying, they're painful. and an overwhelming amount of them can drive her into an almost uncontrollable rage. It's so painful. So she has a special consideration that allows her to wear headphones at school. And frankly, most of her friends are jealous that she gets to wear headphones in class to manage the noise issues. In other words, they all want to do that. And that tells you a little bit about the acoustics of the environment that they're in. Not anyone here's fault because it's a very old school, so I'm sure none of you designed it. But it just goes to show that we have an educational environment. And if kids can't manage the overwhelming stimuli that is hitting them every single day, they just want to block it out. If they block it out, then we're increasing loneliness and disconnection. So we'll think about Natalie as we go through some of these ideas. So what does it mean to design with empathy? I actually don't think this is nearly as complicated as some people think it is. I think it just means thinking a lot about all the various types of people that are in the space, that are going to use the space, and trying to think about how we create an environment in which they can succeed. I don't think it's about making people feel comfortable all the time, just allowing them to feel what they feel without being overwhelmed. So in behavioral healthcare, we are dealing generally, especially at the more acute levels, with patients whose primary their diagnosis leads to symptoms that are largely represented as agitation. So they're already going to be experiencing high level of agitation when they're in the spaces we design. Our job is not necessarily to eliminate that. That's what the clinicians do. Our job is to not contribute to it. And it can be easy in our world to focus on calming environments. But the reality is there's more to an environment than calming. And that's what we're going to get to that a little bit more in a few minutes is the dynamic ideas about what an environment can be. So I think empathy is really trying to think what's the person's experience. When we design an inpatient unit, we think, what is it like when you first arrive? How overwhelming is it to be brought into this space? And how can we manage that process, right? What's it like to be discharged and feel like you're going home? What's that going to feel like? So there's a lot of sort of experiences we want to work through. And so that brings us to the first major point, and this is at the heart of everything our firm does when we're working. So lots of people have different names for this, and pretty much every design firm I know is doing this in some way or another. We call it a choreographed user experience. And I suspect you're all saying, yeah, we do that. And I'm sure you're right. And what we have found, and we work with a lot of architecture firms, what we have found is that some firms have a specialist who does this, comes in, creates a report, and then goes away, and everybody's supposed to follow the report. Some firms integrate it into their teams. In many cases, it doesn't get the level of attention it probably should once budgets and deadlines and schedules and all the competing things we're trying to manage in a project come up. And so if you're not doing it, I would encourage you to. And if you are doing it, I would encourage you to better integrate or do more. And if you're already doing all of that, then enjoy the pictures. But basically, the idea here is everything, 90% of what happens in almost every building is highly predictable, right? So it drives me crazy when I go to a hotel and the process of getting in, getting my stuff, getting to a check-in counter and getting to my room is discombobulated, unclear. There's multiple points where I have to wait in a line, or when it's not clear, oh, I'm talking to the wrong person or whatever. Because every single person that comes to the hotel has the same experience. Why was it not designed for that, right? I see these as design flaws when that happens. And you can see that everywhere: schools, hospitals, museums. So if we identify those flows, and every time we're making a design decision, we're thinking, how is someone moving through this space? How is someone using this space? They're very predictable, and we can design for an optimal experience if we're focused on the experience rather than the look of the space. So that's what that's about. So this is a personal example. So this is a picture of the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. And I was fortunate enough to go there last year. And it was an amazing experience. Highly recommend it. Fantastic museum. Loved it. It's in an old train station. So when you enter the museum, this is the first thing you see. You basically arrive at this point. This picture doesn't fully capture it, but to your right are a whole series of galleries. To your left are a whole series of galleries. Down the stairs is a giant sculpture garden, and to the right and left are a whole series of galleries. The wayfinding's good. If you know where you want to go, you can get there. But if you just want to visit the museum, this was an overwhelming experience. And while we loved our experience in the museum, I will tell you, my wife and I stood at the top of these stairs for probably about 5 minutes, frozen in our shoes, with no idea what to do first. I don't even remember where we went first, but we eventually got moving. And once we did, it all turned out fine. We think we saw a lot. I don't know if we saw everything. Um, but it was such an overwhelming moment. And it's a good reminder of the anxiety that everyone feels when you're overwhelmed by stimuli and have no idea what to do next. It can be hard to process. And if we design spaces where that's happening to people a lot, then we're causing them to have a lot of anxiety about things that are not what they came to that space to do. So we'll just think of that as an example of how we can try and create something better. Which brings us to wayfinding. So the Musée d'Orsay had fantastic wayfinding. If we had gone there specifically to see the Van Gogh exhibit, which was there, or Van Gogh, I never know what the right way to say that is. If we'd gone there for that, we'd had no trouble finding it. The signs were great. We went there to see whatever was there, and that was hard. So wayfinding is important, and in our opinion, wayfinding should be multisensory. Words aren't enough. You need themes, you need images, you need graphics. You need to create a sense of place so people understand there is a place, which is where I am, and there is a place where I want to go. And there's a clear way that I get from the place I am to the place I go. And there's a calmness that comes from knowing I am in the right place or I am going the right way. And so really focusing on wayfinding, and in my mind, wayfinding has to start before you get late in the project to bring on a wayfinding consultant. It really needs to be a planning idea. How does the plan support movement from one place to another? This next one might be somewhat unique to our business. I suspect you all deal with very different issues, but in our world, particularly in an inpatient setting, visibility is hugely important. Every area of the patient's social spaces needs to be visible to staff from everywhere. We're always working to avoid hiding places. So a tremendous amount of time gets spent thinking about all the little details. So, in the bottom right here, this is a nurse station design. Well, we want that transaction counter to be high enough to cover the computer monitor so that the computer monitor isn't accessible to patients. But it needs to be low enough so that a staff person sitting in that chair can see over it. You'd be surprised how much time and effort goes into trying to get just that one thing right. I imagine visibility means something very, very different in education design, and I'm not going to guess at what that is. But I do think that really digging into those details and thinking what happens when there's tall people, what happens when there's short people, what about different heights of chairs, what are the different ways that people respond to the heights and relationships between things when we're looking at visibility. So in our world, this is incredibly important, and I expect for you just a different way, but still important. So this is probably at the heart of what I want to talk about today. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this one. Social dynamics. One of the things that I'm sure you all learned was, we had this intervention that occurred to us recently in which we all decided we were just not going to go out anymore because nobody enjoys that. So we all stayed home for a couple of years. We cooked our own food and we watched TV on our own TV and we hung out in our own house and we just spent time with our family and everything was great because we loved that so very, very much. And what we all learned was our house is more private, safer, more secure, and more convenient than any place else we go. And when we opened the doors and they let us out of our houses, we rushed back to all those places that are less comfortable, less convenient, less secure, less private, have worse acoustics, and we couldn't wait to get back to them. So why do we do that? Why do we love crowds? Why do we go out? Why do we want to be in places that are objectively less good than the place than our home, in order to be happy. And I think it speaks to human engagement. We don't want comfort. We don't want privacy. We don't want, I mean, we do, but it's not always a priority. Um, I was years ago, I was on a ski trip with my son, and it was very, very cold day. And we were riding up the ski lift, and he turned to me and he said, "I am so uncomfortable right now." And he said, "But I am having so much fun. I didn't know you could have fun and be uncomfortable." And I said, "I'm pretty sure the funnest things there are uncomfortable." So I think we have to get beyond the idea that people want comfort and start to get through to the idea that people want engagement. And there's this complex idea behind what people want and what does that mean for the design of, for in our world, a social and therapeutic space. What does it mean about the design of a classroom? What does it mean about the design of a cafeteria? Um, you know, if if people wanted a space in which every table was exactly the same, then restaurants would be that way. But the best restaurants are not that way, right? They offer varieties of seating and different types of view. You can go to the same restaurant multiple times and have different experiences. Um, and so all of those are things we put into our thinking. The other one is about group size. I'm going to talk a little bit later about that. But what's the right size group? In what environment? Are you more comfortable hanging out in a small coffee shop or in a big restaurant? Do you like to be in crowded parks, or do you like to walk along a greenway? So if you think about your own responses to those, you can start to bring that into the design of anything that you're designing, and basically think, what do people really want out of this? Because it's not the least common denominator. It's not just comfort. It's dynamic engagement, right? In some way or another. So I think we spend a tremendous amount of time on this. One of our rules when you're designing group spaces is you start with furniture. You don't finish with furniture. You start there. And the walls should form around what the right furniture layout is, not the other way around. That's kind of a radical concept for a lot of design schedules, but if you incorporate that furniture layout really early, you'll find that you can create a more dynamic space that is integrated and makes sense. So moving into our world, we look at a variety of things that help us. So what I want to talk about is, in behavioral health, we use the concept of decrowding. There was a really great research study by Ulrich and others that really studied the effect of crowding. Now, crowding does not mean forcing a whole bunch of people into a small room. Crowding is a broader psychological concept that is about freedom of choice, about being around people you want to be around, but not be around people you don't want to be around. There's a couple of great examples to think about crowding. One of them is the move your feet, lose your seat example, right? I have seen social spaces for patient units designed in which there are 12 patients and there are 12 seats. Well, somebody's going to like one seat better than another. And I think we can all feel the anxiety when we don't want to get up out of our chair because we know if we go to the bathroom and come back, someone's going to take it. That's unkind, right? We should have more seats. We should have more choices. We should have more flexibility. Another great way to think about crowding is, your whole family is at your house for Thanksgiving and you can't go hide in your bedroom. You may not be literally crowded. Your house might be big enough for all the people that are there, but there is a level of anxiety. Now, maybe you love everyone in your family tremendously, and this is the most joyous thing you can think of. But for most people, there's a certain level of anxiety that comes with having that many people in a space that doesn't usually have that many people. And that feeling is crowding. Um, so when we look at spaces, we look at social density, and we look at crowding, and we look at measures to reduce the feeling of crowding. Daylight helps, high ceilings help, having a variety of seating, having a variety of space types. This image on the bottom left kind of shows a larger social space, and right connected to it is this smaller nook. Well, the thing is, that nook's really part of the space, completely visible, but you feel a little bit separated when you're in there, and that helps. The image in the upper right shows one of our favorite interventions, which is these little nooks up in the little blue nooks in the background. You can use those to sit with your back to the wall. You're in the room, you're fully visible, you're engaged, but you feel like you can sort of curl up into your own little cave. So that's another part of social dynamics, is really thinking about how crowding affects. So as a research idea, that's a place that if you're not already, you might study more. And then there's just the idea of community, right? I mean, we know we're having a loneliness epidemic in this country, and what we want to do is have a sense of community. We could argue all day long about whose fault it is and the role of the internet, social media, and all those things, but it doesn't matter because we don't control those, or at least we don't control those in our role as designers. You can engage with your community and your families, but as designers, the question is, how do we support the idea of community? How do we encourage relationships and culture building within the spaces that we're creating? And a lot of times that has to do with uniqueness, right? It's hard to create relationships and connection, and particularly culture building in a space that is generic and looks like every other space. And so, you look at the iconic image in the bottom of the old Friends show. If you tried to imagine that exact same space happening in one of the strip mall Starbucks that have become very generic in a lot of places, it doesn't work the same. The space encourages the sense of culture that they built that show around. So the architecture is part of it. The architecture, the interior design, the furniture, and we can incorporate that idea into the things that we do. So moving on to another topic that I'm quite certain nobody will be shocked by and everybody knows everything about, which is the impact of nature. Biophilia is a big part of design. I know you're all doing it. I know you're all thinking about it probably as much or more than we do, because in our world, we have some very unique restrictions. And again, I'm going to focus on the more restrictive elements of behavioral health care, so inpatient and residential treatment, for example. We have a lot of things that challenge the design of outdoor space for patients. Some of them might be useful for you all, and some of them might not. So one of the challenges is they're highly enclosed. The regulations require that we put 14-foot walls and or enclose with buildings all of our outdoor spaces. So one of the challenges, we have a lot of wall space. And the other challenge is we often find it's very difficult to use real landscaping in these spaces, not because of anything to do with design, but because only people who have been HIPAA cleared from privacy standpoint can go in the space. So if you use an outside landscape company and they turn over their staff regularly, they can't come in that courtyard. They can't come in that space. So either you have to maintain your own or you have to agree not to do it. Plus, if it's inside the building, how do they even get in there? So we've started to adapt a lot to using rubber surfaces and artificial turf. And we've really moved to the idea of dynamic sensory spaces and the idea that the walls are every bit as important as the ground plane. So whether it's chalkboard paint, which I call organic art therapy, um, or whether it's sensory play, artificial green walls up high where people can't touch them, but it still makes the space feel green. On the left side, those are what are called Euroflex balls. Kids love those. You can sit on them, you can jump on them, you can run across them. We use those quite a bit. And so there's a lot of these little interventions that we've found by incorporating them. We create a multi-sensory space that does not just inspire calmness. What it inspires is wonder and play and activity. And that's what the patients we're working with need in order to progress in their therapy. And I imagine that a lot of the kids that you're designing for have a similar set of needs to blow off steam and get out of the classroom. So we want to make sure that they've got what they need. So there's just a few ideas. I could spend a whole hour just on this, but there's a few ideas to consider thinking differently about your outdoor space. Lighting strategies. I'm sure I'll shock no one by saying that there's no better lighting source than the sun, and that access to daylight is incredibly important. There have been quite a few healthcare studies that have really proven the impact of daylight on recovery. And I imagine there's similar research in the education world, and that you're all doing your best to accomplish that. What I'll put out there is this: with the advent of LED lighting, you can generally get lights that are in any temperature and color you want. And because you can do that, it's our opinion that you must do that. You must educate yourself about it and not rely only on engineers to just pick the right colors, but to make it an intentional design solution. So I'm going to show you a couple of things we do in our world that maybe you can figure out a way to translate to yours. So this is an example of a bedroom in which we're using multiple layers of colors. And yes, for anyone who's wondering, you can mix different colors of lighting in the same space because really they're all white. So they don't interfere with one another. We've gotten this question from clients. It works great to put multiple different lighting colors in a space. So this is a case where what we did is we went through every light that was in this room and we identified what the right color temperature for it should be. And I want to note, we did not use a lighting control system. We just put them on different switches and trusted that the person in the room will select whatever is most comfortable for them. And we have had a lot of success with this idea. So I'm going to show you another even simpler version of that. This is a group therapy room. So in a super simple way, in a group therapy room, this room gets used for a lot of things, but when it's doing group therapy, they arrange the chairs in a circle and they all face each other. So it's really important that you have even lighting that hits everyone's face roughly the same. So we have this nice little drum light in the middle. And then they also do didactic learning in here, and they do creative play, and they watch TV. So we've also got these can lights in the ceiling around the perimeter, as well as a strip light highlighting the graphics. So the strip light and the drum light are 2700K, and the can lights are at 3500K. And there's just 2 light switches in the room. And we go back, we do this all the time, and every single time we go back and talk to the users after they've been using it. We ask them, which light switch do they use? And they always give us the same answer. Oh, when we're doing group therapy, we turn the can lights off. We just love the lighting we get from that drum light. Oh yeah, but when we're watching TV or when we're doing this or doing that, we turn on the can lights because we like the better clarity. Well, that's exactly how we wanted them to use the space. And we don't have to teach them. No training is needed. They just naturally understand what lighting feels comfortable. And it gets us away from complex lighting control systems, which is a little bit authoritarian, right? We're kind of telling them ahead of time that we know what lights they want to turn on and off. So we prefer, I guess I'll call it a slightly more democratic approach, which is just give them some choices and trust them to make good decisions. I don't know how that applies to a classroom, but maybe teachers can do the same thing that the staff in these facilities do and choose their lights. I think this is going to be my last major point, is going to be acoustics. So once again, I'm sure that there's nothing I can teach you all about acoustics, designing schools. I'm sure you spend a tremendous amount of time on that. But I want to introduce a concept, which is the shape of a space. So one of the challenges we run into when we're designing treatment spaces is that we have very little access to soft materials. Everything's hard. And we can do a certain amount in the ceilings and we have a few interventions, but it's not enough. And the acoustics of a space are so important. So we think about acoustics from the very first moment that we are planning a space. And we call this concept de-squaring the room. So in a very simple way, the worst possible acoustical space is a square with a flat floor and a flat ceiling and 4 parallel walls. Well, 2 parallel and 2 parallel. Sound just bounces happily around there forever, creating what we call cacophony. Well, we don't call it, acousticians call it cacophony. So one of our theories is let's de-square the room. And there's a lot of ways you can de-square a room, but the best way to do it is when you're actually planning the space. So it's an intentional move and you're putting the walls where you want. So there's different ways of doing it. You see the upper right, or maybe in the middle image, we've angled the wall in the southern part of the room. We've sawtoothed the wall on the right side of the room. And we've got some benches with a little fin sticking out on the north side of the room. And on the left side of the room, we've got some wood paneling. Now, all of those are de-squaring techniques, right? There's not a parallel wall in there. I mean, the sound bounces and has nowhere to go, and it just naturally diffuses. And I can tell you, we did a similar thing on the ceiling. So that's an example of de-squaring a room, and you really have to plan for that up front, right? It's very hard to de-square rooms that have all been laid out in nice little boxes. The image on the bottom is an example of using. You might criticize that and say we created a bunch of wasted space. But what we did is we nested a group room and a couple of toilets together. And those angles are also happen to shoot directly back to the nurse station. So there's pure visibility into each of these spaces. But again, if you don't plan for that from the beginning, it's very hard to come back and create this kind of effect afterwards. And then there's some smaller design interventions you can do afterwards. On the right-hand side, you see the pop-up in the ceiling and the change in materials in the cove. You see the nooks on the wall. All of that de-squares a room. And all of that improves the acoustics without using soft materials. I mean, if you look, there's almost no soft materials in that picture. But I've been in that space quite a few times with patients in it, and acoustically, it works really well. On the left-hand side, you see an image of a simple wall paneling. Not only is that a nice way to de-square a room because it creates a lot of just basic ins and outs in texture, it's also a really nice way to create durable. That is literally paintable, paint grade plywood and 1x4 hardwood trim. It's inexpensive, it's very durable, and all you have to do when it gets mucked up is you just paint it. Bucket maintenance is the easiest kind of maintenance there is. But it also helps de-square a room, but it's also great for things like durability and other things. It's one of our favorite techniques. Not all of our clients will let us do it. Some hospitals have an anti-wood policy, so real wood can't be used, but many of our clients love the idea, and we use it. So I'm going to finish with these two quotes that I think are great. The Center for Health Design has said that the design of any environment has the ability to enable health, wellness, and recovery, or to act as the barrier to restoration and healing. And the AIA Academy of Architecture for Health said no environment is neutral. And I think this is a really important point to end on, which is to say, it's not, the things we're talking are not value add. It's not, if you don't do them, you're not hurting anyone, but it'd be great if you could do them. So maybe I'm aiming this more at the clients who might be listening, which is if you're not doing them, then you are not doing them. No environment is neutral. If you're not doing the right things to create a space that is inclusive of everybody, then you are creating a space that it is not inclusive of everybody. And so it's binary. And I'm usually anti-binary in the sense of choices are more complicated than that. But I think this one is, if you don't do it, you're kind of not doing it. So I really like the quote that no environment is neutral. And I will leave you with that. So we're into questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can see faces.
That's Kevin. Thank you so much. So I think we've had a lot of great questions. And so I guess we'll follow up on some of those. I appreciate so much of what you were talking about. I think there are a lot of similarities and parallels to the work that we do. I guess my first question comes when you're talking a lot about kind of the choreography and having that kind of choreographed user experience. You know, for a lot of us that are on this call, we're architects and engineers. What questions do you recommend that we ask either ourselves as designers or our clients as we are being intentional in that choreography?
Oh, great question. My favorite question in the entire world to ask clients is why. I think as architects we have a tendency to take orders like we're at a restaurant. What do you want? How many of them do you want? But the really important question is why? Why are we doing this? What is the purpose? If we know the purpose, talented designers can do amazing things if they know what we're really trying to solve. So a little story from years ago made me so proud that this has been my bugaboo for a long time. But my son, when he was in high school, his girlfriend asked him to help her design and build a birdhouse. And the first thing he asked is, why do you want it? And they had a whole conversation. In the end, she figured out what she wanted and they found something that already existed that she could get. But this conversation about why led her to a better conclusion than she would have gotten if they just pulled down some plans off the internet and built a birdhouse, right? So, or bird cage or whatever
Sure,
it was.
sure.
We're big believers in asking our clients why and letting them be good at their job, right? So we work with clinicians a lot. They're all smarter than us, but they're not smarter than us about design.
Right.
So we try to avoid trying to make them be good at design, and we try to ask them questions that they can intelligently answer by asking them why and how, and then we figure out the what. So I think when it comes to a choreographed user experience, we're asking them is why and how. We have a meeting coming up that we're just prepping for this morning, and we're trying to figure out which way to design something. And I said, they got 50 people who are going to use this space. Why don't we just set up a diagram so we can ask them, where do you want those 50 people at 10 o'clock in the morning? Where do you want them at 2 o'clock in the afternoon? Where do you want them to eat lunch? If we start to understand how they want all these little people to flow around their space, we'll figure out how to design it. So that's an example of how we would ask the question.
That's perfect. Well, and that goes back to your theme of empathy. You're designing for the people and their experience through it all. So that's perfect. Next question I had, you talked a lot about visibility. Visibility is important for us in educational design too. To maybe different kinds of safety concerns, but safety is obviously a very timely topic for any industry, but especially for schools. And so I appreciated your comments about safety and having that line of visibility. With that, is it a balance also for that you open up transparency from a safety perspective, but that you also find spaces where people can feel secure and comfortable so that it's that healthy balance?
It is. You know, I showed you a couple of pictures of those little nooks. We love
Mhm.
those. And the only criticism we ever get when we put nooks like that into patient spaces is, I wish we had more.
Mm.
Um, we've done so many examples of that, so many different projects, and people love them. They are great seating spaces. So little nooks like that. I mean, my house has a window seat because when I had the architect's dream. I got to design and build my own house,
Yeah,
and my daughter specifically asked for a window seat, so she got a custom designed window seat just for her. And I mean, it's a popular space. We use
that's
it,
right.
right? Those little nooks, those little window seats, people just love them. So that's great, and they're visible. Um, I'm always careful about the word balance. I'm a yes and kind of guy. I believe balance is a fancy word for compromise.
Mm.
I don't care for. I think if we know what we're trying to accomplish, most of the time we can accomplish all of it. It just takes a lot of work to figure out what the yes and solution is. We get asked in our world, how do you balance a therapeutic environment with safety and security? The answer is you don't. I mean, no one can, you can never ever compromise safety and security in the world we work in, right? It's probably true for you too. But
Same.
we also must create a therapeutic environment, or what's the point of bringing a patient to a hospital if they're not going to get better? So it has to be a yes and. And I suspect in your world, that's what it has to be too. It has to be a yes and. Um, and I don't know what the answers are in education.
Right.
I barely know what they are in our world, but I think I know what they are pretty well. We have a lot of strategies, but
Right.
sometimes it's about using a non-conventional material, right? So for us, that wood paneling, when clients are open to it, is a budget-friendly way to make something safer, right? Because if the patient doesn't put a dent in the wall, then we don't have to bring a maintenance person into a patient space. Well, that's safer, right?
Hmm.
So it's sort of how do you define safety, but also provide choice and dignity to the people in the space.
Right.
Nobody wants to feel like cattle.
Right. Well, I appreciated the yes, and I think we as architects for education, the balance for us is the transparency and the learning on display and natural light and windows in conjunction with safety. And so finding that yes and solution that is treating people with dignity, but also safety is a perfect solution. So I like that.
I don't know if your budgets will allow it. We use very expensive glass in our projects. that's 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 a lot of how we use so much of it is it's not regular glass. We use a lot of very difficult to break glass.
Yeah, we sometimes do, and sometimes that's jurisdictionally driven, but that's a good thought and consideration. Um, One of the things we have seen in a lot of education, and what one of the reasons we're having this whole seminar is we've heard from educators and administrators the importance of mental health and the kinds of strains that they're seeing because of what kiddos are coming to school with. You obviously design behavioral health facilities. Tell us a little bit about kind of what you're seeing on the pediatric front and the kind of things that you're seeing, because a lot of that is obviously coming into the schools, and with kids spending the lion's share of their week in school, making sure we are more aware of it, but then also can design intentionally using a lot of the great principles and practices. But what kind of things are you seeing specifically related to kind of pediatric units?
Sure. So we're doing a lot of children's units in hospitals right now. The need has been highly recognized, and everybody's scrambling to try to fill that need and to try to do better for our kids. So we're seeing a lot of this. I think I think it's important to recognize that in our world, what we realize is that kids are different. And there's a lot of different categories. First of all, we try and differentiate between adolescents and children because their needs are very different. I mean, you obviously do that too because they're in completely different schools.
Mm-hmm.
So that's almost easier. We try to. The joke is in healthcare, don't Disneyfy the children's unit because half the people there are going to be adolescents and they're not going to like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So part of it is that. Part of it is that they really need play and engagement. We push hard for a lot of play and engagement, not just in the play and engagement time, but in the spaces where they're getting therapy and having a lot of interventions that give them those opportunities. Part of it also is, and this goes into my conversation about, people don't just want to be comfortable, they want to be engaged. Kids don't just need to be accommodated, they need to be taught resiliency. So I have this great line from the movie Finding Nemo where Marlin says, "But I promised I'd never let anything happen to him." And Dory says, "But then nothing would ever happen to him." Right? I think when you're designing environments for kids, you have to recognize that things do need to happen to them and they need to learn to deal with it, but it needs to be done in a safe and supportive way. So we don't need to helicopter in and protect them. We need to support them. We need to make sure that they have the tools to deal with the obstacles that they're facing and not remove the obstacles within limits. There's some obstacles that should be removed, right? And so I think it's a balancing act between trying to figure out how do we create environments that encourage that development of resiliency while also providing that supportive environment where they feel affirmed. And then the other part of this, and you might get to this in a question, but I know we talked in the prep a little bit about sensory issues. We spend a lot of time thinking of multi-sensory environments. So the things that I showed with the courtyards, a lot of those are what I would call sensory interventions. They're not a quote unquote sensory room. They're just a place where sensory interventions, and they can happen all over the place. In fact, I have, if you don't mind, I have a couple of slides that I
No, that'd be
helped.
perfect. That was my next question,
That was your
because
next question.
we're seeing sensory rooms inserted into certain schools and for certain age groups. But I was recently touring a school actually up in the DFW area, and they had created a sensory room for their teachers. And it was that realization that, maybe we all need this, not just some of the kids or some of the time, but if we can have that kind of level of engagement and interaction and be more intentional with it, then everyone reaps the benefits, not just when you're having maybe an elevated moment or a time where you need to be separated. So I'd love to see kind of the work you're doing.
Yeah, so the phrase we like to use is multi-sensory environment, which is just acknowledging that everybody relies on different senses in different ways to explore their environment. It's not really a one way is better than another. So this just happens to be a couple of slides from a presentation we did to a client in which they wanted to look at sensory interventions. And so we just gave them some options this was part of a much larger presentation, but this was a traditional sensory room experience, the digital technology, the immersive experience, et cetera, et cetera. And then this got into it's more about touch and sort of nature inspired. So, if you can't have windows, you can do the skylight sky ceiling. But we really emphasized things that people can safely touch. And it's amazing how much you get out of simply being able to touch texture in a safe way. And then this third option really got into play and wonder and ways to incorporate that into spaces. Once again, there's a little nook, there's a little play wall that you can touch, stars that you can look at, and not shown on here, but I showed it earlier. We're huge fans of chalkboard walls. You guys can probably do whiteboard walls, but in our environment, the pens for the whiteboard walls are not safe
Mm,
for a patient who might want to harm themselves. So we use chalk, because
okay.
at best that's an antacid. So
Mm,
not really particularly dangerous. But these are just some of the things that we look at. But touch, smell, sound, being able to control sounds and lights. And doesn't have to be the student. The teacher can do it. There may be times when just giving them dimmable lights might make a big difference in how their classroom feels, or being able to even out lines. Some solitubes are great when it comes to evening out lighting between a window wall on one side and a darker wall on the other side.
right.
Uh, those are all, in my mind, sensory interventions.
Perfect. Well, I appreciate in all of your examples your kind of practical applications because classrooms are squared rooms, so de-squaring the room, we have a lot of opportunity to take advantage of that to help all students, but especially students that are struggling with auditory kind of stressors. And so I think I guess asked all of our questions, but I'll say, Kevin, thank you again. Thank you for the time. Thanks everyone for joining. Again, if you have additional questions that we can be the conduit, we will send to Kevin. Kevin is a wonderful resource for us. So again, it's wellness@pbk.com where you can send your questions. Again, this is the first of our series. We look forward to seeing you again in June to have our second discussion. But Kevin, thank you for your expertise and time. We really appreciate it, and we've learned so much and look forward to applying a lot of these great principles to help and help create, I guess, more choreographed and empathetic experience for the people that use our facilities and buildings. So
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me, and I hope some of this inspires everybody to find some ways to incorporate things, or maybe just have a new and fresh idea that will expand your thinking in some way. So.
perfect. Thanks everyone for joining. Have a great Friday. Thanks again, Kevin.